Hello, and welcome to a new episode of Intellings, where we discuss groundbreaking nonfiction books and talk to their authors. Today, we have Tom Fisher as our guest. Tom is the author of The Key to 10, Downing Street, where he identifies various keys or factors that can determine the outcome of future UK elections. The concept is inspired by the works of famous US professor Alan Lichtman and his legendary book, The Keys to the White House, a surefire guide to predicting the next president, published in 2008. Tom has both adapted and expanded on this remarkable concept for his book. So, let's dive right into the conversation.
Tom, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for making the time. This is a very interesting book that you've written. So tell us how you actually came up with this idea.
Well, it began back in the autumn 2016, the American election campaign in 2016, where I discovered Alan Lichtman on YouTube. He interviewed on various American channels like Fox, CNN, and the others, talking about his keys. And I found this is fascinating. And I really got into it. And because obviously he was right. He predicted a Trump win. And so I then proceeded to buy his book. I studied it minutely. I thought about it a lot. But the idea of translating it to the UK, that came when I was on a long walk on the Isle of Wight, going from Carisbrooke to the Needles in September 2020, just in my head, thinking, yeah, this actually does work with the UK. The next 18 months, it was just a sort of, I suppose you've got a nerdish kind of hobby. I did a little bit of reading around and just thinking about it. I got to just the end of the lockdown, so it was about February 22, and I thought, I wonder if I could actually make this into a book. I thought it should be too difficult. I thought, I wonder if I can try. So I contacted Alan Lichtman. He gave me authorization, provided I obviously credited him, which I was very happy to do. So I was there, and it took 2 years to write the book, and quite a lot of research. I got quite a lot of books. Some of the best books, people like Anthony Selden on modern politics, also Peter Hennessy, who's a kind of specialist of post-war history. Andrew Rawnsley, I thought, was a very good writer on the Blair Brown years. I read Thatcher's own memoirs, Downing Street years, many other things. And I translated it to the UK. And as you say quite rightly, there are differences. Now, the difference in American election is that it's a binary contest. It's a presidential election. It's either Democrat or Republican candidate. Occasionally they have third parties, but increasingly not. But the UK is a parliamentary system, so my system predicts actual majorities. But what is similar for Lichtman is that the basic premise of his method, and with mine, is that an election doesn't work in the way that the average person in the street might think. It's not a beauty contest. It's not a contest between two personalities, who's more charismatic and exciting. Very, very little to do with who's got the cleverest campaign, who's got the best attack ads, who spent the... It's not about the money. We talk about this abstracted, the money. It's not about how much money is dumped into the campaign. It's not about what promises parties pledge in their manifestos. People often think, oh, if we say X, we're going to do X, Y, and Z, we're going to win. It's often alleged that parties lie, win the election based on lies about tax. But that's not so. It's not about that. It is always entirely a referendum on the competence of the governing party. If they seem to have done a good job, they get re-elected. If they've screwed up in office, they get turfed out. In Lichtman's model, there's one key that the opposition can have, that's opposition charisma. If a candidate is charismatic or a national hero, that does make a difference. That's true in the UK as well, but I found in the UK the quality of the opposition matters a little bit more than that, because we've had several elections where the opposition is simply not taken seriously, partly because in our system you can lose half, like in the last election, the Tories lost 2/3 of their seats. You could be so smashed down that the opposition doesn't have any credibility. So I put a special key, opposition implausibility key, and also third parties are more important in the UK. So I put a few more keys there. Because his method is 13 keys, and the key is essentially a true or false statement from the point of view of the governing party. So, for example, is the economy must not be in recession during the election campaign, true or false? GDP term is greater than the average GDP of the two previous terms, or at least equal to it, true or false. That's his method. Each key is weighted equally. Mine is mostly the same, but I've added a few more, like third-party bonus key. For example, third party from the opposition, which is damaging the main opposition party. For example, the SDP alliance in the 1980s. A few differences like that, but his method: 6 false keys and you're out. The governing party loses. In my system, it's a bit similar, but it's tied to the majority. So 0 false keys, all keys true. You get a majority of 135. For each key that turns false, the government lose 15 seats. The majority comes down by 30. 5 false keys, you've lost your majority. And then for each key that turns from then on, there's a heavier loss of seats because there's a piling on effect. The government's unpopular already. Something else goes wrong. It just proves how useless they are. People want to give them a kicking. 6 false keys, when you lost 20. From 5 to 6 false keys, you lose 20 seats. 6 to 7, 25, and so on. Cumulative effect is the case. Basically, the book I published, it fits into 2 categories. It's political, but it's also modern history. It's how the system worked in all the elections since the end of World War II, from February 1950 to 2019. And it basically, in order to do that, it tells you the history of that whole period. So we've got maybe, I don't know how many dozen pages or so of the Attlee years. Then it explains the keys, here's the actual result, and then so on and so forth. I did get it out just before the last election, caught rather on the hop by Rishi Sunak. When Nigel Farage came back after ruling himself out, I knew that the forecasting book was wrong, so I minted a new key for him, the third-party charisma key, because the effect of a dynamic personality in itself on the third party, which of course was correct, because the reform went up from about 10 points to about 15 points and in the polls. So I lost my £30 bet on the majority, but I did put an updated forecast on Facebook. I said Labour majority of 170, and they got 174. I think it was the ITN or the Sky exit poll also said 170, so I got about as close as you could get. So that's the story.
And why do you think that Professor Lichtman, he got it wrong this time? And do you intend bringing that into your next edition?
Well, yes, I think, to be honest, I think he's suffering from bias. He's viscerally anti-Trump. He wrote a book called The Case for Impeachment well before J6. I mean, a lot of people are, but the trouble is if you're a forecaster, that kind of bias gets into your forecast and makes it very difficult. I did predict the American election in an article for the University of Bournemouth, entitled Why I Think Alan Lichtman is Wrong This Time. I did a seminar at the uni just after the election, but the forecast was written in October. It's a very interesting elections. American election 24, I counted 6 false keys. The mandate key is true if the governing party have made an advance in the House of Representatives. It's the number of seats in the House of Representatives at the last midterms. So the Dems have to have got more seats in 2022 than they had in the 2018 midterms. That's obviously false because 2018 Trump was unpopular, the Dems did well. 2020, 2022 they went downhill. So that's obviously false, objectively so. The next key, the incumbency key, that was false because obviously Biden was the president, but he was forced to drop out. So that key is false. The third key, which I think almost certainly was false, is the contest key or the nomination key. There must not be a serious contest. Now, Lichtman technically defines it as in the nomination, the convention, the nominated candidate has to get at least 2/3 of the nominations. Kamala Harris, she did that, but the trouble was Biden had won the primaries and was pushed out following that awful debate. He didn't want to go, forced out, so effectively that there was a contest, so that key was lost. Charisma key is false because Kamala Harris is not really charismatic. Opposition charisma key was true because although Trump is charismatic to his base, he's not charismatic beyond it. He's too polarizing. The third party key, when Robert Kennedy Jr. came close to triggering the key, but he dropped in the polls after Biden dropped out, and then he joined forces with Trump, so that was true. The economy key is very more tricky. Technically, they're certainly true, but there's a lot of talk in the media of a vibe session around half the population thinking the economy was in recession. I mooted that key could be turned false, partly through disinformation. Subsequent polls I've looked at since would suggest probably not. It was the nomination key that was false. But where I will disagree with Lichtman is on foreign policy. He counts the support for Ukraine as a foreign policy success, but I don't think the bloody stalemate in Ukraine is any kind of a success, really. I mean, if they'd forced Russia to withdraw or got a decent sort of peace, an armistice or something, that would be a foreign policy success. But the situation is actually not a success. It's more like Korea in 1952, which in Lichtman's book he counted as a failure for Harry Truman. Foreign policy failure, that was forced because of Afghanistan, having border problems, and the inability or unwillingness to restrain Israel in Gaza, in war that went on by that point for over a year. Policy change was true because Biden had made major policy changes. Scandal key was true, unlike a lot of YouTube commentators saying that key's fault. It was true because Hunter Biden was in some trouble. None of it was linked to his father. And the idea that Biden took classified documents home when he wasn't prosecuted for that, they decided not to prosecute for that anyway. It was something that he was accused of doing before becoming president. I don't think that would have done it. And there was some civil unrest about Gaza in the spring, but it petered out well before the elections. Looking at that election, got 6 false keys. Looking at it now, I think certainly the problems with Biden debate, the way he was sort of trashed and pushed out, and the loss of the incumbency key, that cost the Democrats the election.
A couple of days ago, when we were talking about the keys, you mentioned that you've added a few keys to the original 13 keys. What these keys are and why have you added them?
Okay. Well, in the UK, I think there have been cases where the opposition is so weak that it has made a difference, partly because it's a party-based system, and in our system, parties can be devastated in elections and be very weak. Whereas in America, it's more about the candidate. Even if you have a terrible candidate, the whole party isn't weak in the same way. So Michael Foot, Labour in 1983, Michael Howard in 2005, William Hague in 2001, Labour again with Corbyn in 2019. They were not taken seriously. They were dismissed as a joke. And so I give as a bonus key to the government, which accurately predicts the election. Also, a curious one was opposition culpability key, which I created for the 2005 election, which is rather difficult to work in the system. It's because Conservatives, first under Ian Duggan Smith and then under Michael Howard, defended and enabled the Iraq War. They enabled the vote in the Commons, and Howard defended it right through the election campaign. They supported an unpopular government policy, thereby throwing away the possibility of gaining votes resulting from its unpopularity. So opposition, I think, complicity, if the government is seen as really bad and the opposition defend it to the hilt, they've sort of shot themselves in the foot a bit. So also the third-party bonus key, which I mentioned, because in America it's never been a case where the third party has actually benefited the government by splitting the opposition. But in the US, it clearly was the case for the SDP. Opposition charisma, I made that key for Nigel Farage because it's quite clear that the return of this sort of quite persuasive personality would make a significant difference in the level of the support for reform. And of course, with the reform charisma key, it's starting from a lower base of support, only about 10%. So Lichtman talks about the charisma key only applies if the candidate support is broad, extending beyond traditional boundaries. For example, the Reagan Democrats in the 80s were Democrats, but they liked Ronald Reagan. For someone like Nigel Farage, his support base is much lower to begin with, so he doesn't need to appeal to the majority, just needs to push beyond the typical bounds of third party. So I created those keys, most because of the peculiarities of our system. They wouldn't work in America.
There is also a visible rise in the popularity of, right-wing politics, and that is across, I would say, the Western world. I probably would exclude Australia and New Zealand, but they are also getting there. But it's definitely visible in Europe. AfD is gaining a lot of popularity in Germany. And I think UK is a latecomer to this. The UK, how would these keys play out once a right-wing party or right-wing politics takes over the UK, please?
Yes, well, with reform, I pose a difficulty for the keys. Obviously, the last election, it's from a point of view of the Tory government, reform is clearly a danger to them. So that one third-party key, the Liberal Democrats triggered another third-party key because although they're coming from a different ideological mould, they were attacking in different ways. Liberals taking whole seats, reform more taking popular votes. So it's a double third-party key turned against Sunak's government. The next election will be from the point of view of Labour, and the question is, are reform a bigger danger to the Tories or to Labour, or both? In Lichtman's model, he says third party is always bad news for the government, even if it takes a roughly equal number of votes from the government and the main opposition, because it's a barometer indicator that something's wrong, something's up. People are not happy, and when people are not happy, the government gets the blame. Even if a third party takes as many votes from the main opposition, people aren't happy, the government are going to lose votes in other ways, to the main opposition, to apathy. But for example, in 1968, William Wallace, the right-wing candidate, took probably as many votes away from Richard Nixon as it did from Democrat Hubert Humphreys, but the key still turned. And the same for Ross Perot in the 90s. It's a problem for the government in power. Reform do turn the key against Labour, but you could, I mean, you could argue, are they a split from the Conservative Party or something else? I would say they're not from a split on the opposition party in the same way that the SDP were a split in the Labour movement in the 80s, because you had the Gang of Four, Owens and Roy Jenkins. They left the Labour Party, but set up their own party, did an alliance with the Liberals. That's clearly a split on the opposition. Formed, they was basically the descendants of UKIP, and that goes back quite a long way. And it was found in 2015. I think UKIP took roughly as many votes for old Labour supporters as it did from the Tories. So I think it's a barometer indicator that will still turn the key against Labour. But what's also happened is the Greens have gone up in support, and if they get averaging around 10%, that will be a key against Labour too, because that's an attack from a very different ideological mould. The keys, I think they still work. Whoever's in power, for example, the change key, the government wins the key if they've made significant policy change. It doesn't matter if the change is right-wing or left-wing, it's just that the change is made. People have said to me, oh, these keys don't work because Trump is a new phenomenon. He's like a cult leader, or he's a godfather figure. No, the keys still work. Predicted him in 2016. They predicted his defeat in 2020 and his return in 2024. So what I've seen in America is that because of this growing polarization, you don't get the huge landslides you had, say, 40 years ago. Reagan in 84 took every state but one. Nixon in 72 took every state, didn't take the District of Columbia, but took everything else. That doesn't happen anymore because there's fewer people who are willing to change sides because they're more polarized. They're people who vote Democrat come what may, Republican come what may. So the swing of the pendulum in the states is less, but there are still people changing views. An argument could be in hyper-polarization, hyper-partisanship, competency doesn't matter anymore. So it's like like James O'Brien talks about a footballification of politics. But I still think the keys would work because only a percentage of people are like that. Your vote does rise and fall according to your competence. So I think the keys do work. As I would agree partially about Farage, I would say he's on the right, but he's not far right. He's not an extremist. He's just right wing. If you get a very extreme party, again, the keys will still work. If it's a third party threat, it will turn the key against the government. So Alan Lichtman thinks disinformation meant his keys didn't work. 2024. I think that's quite wrong. I believe the keys do work. He said obviously individual human forecasters are fallible, but
there is a huge issue of migration. Yeah. What role does this particular issue play in this whole picture that you've painted?
Well, certainly it's fueling the rise of reform. So it's helped to turn the third party key against the Conservatives last time, and quite possibly against Labour next time. Even 2015 election, it was significant enough. Of course, it the main factor behind Brexit, which of course had changed. Brexit, I think was cited as a foreign policy failure. 2024, because by then most people saw it as a failed policy. It also one the policy change key. It was a major policy change, but but also it had a knock-on effect on the economy. Yes, but in the States, I think Democrats' failure or unwillingness to control the southern border would contribute to the loss of the foreign policy failure key as well. I mean, you often believe that they were doing it in order to try and flip southern states blue, because of this assumption that the Hispanic people come automatically with Democrat voters. That's false. In the last election, there's quite a substantial swing of Hispanic people towards Trump. And also younger black men. The Dem lead in New York was cut to only 12 points. It was their worst showing in New York since 1988. So this proves one of Alan Lichtman's maxims: demographics are not destiny. Because identity politics, it views ethnic minorities as like robots, automatons who will vote Labour or Democrat forever and ever. If you get enough of them, then the Democrats will win. But that's right, it's insulting. It's basically racist idea. It's not true, because they, like anybody else, vote on the basis of perceived government competence. If you have the idea of flood the southern states of immigrants who turn the state blue, I don't think it works. If you do a bad job, you lose, regardless of the skin colour of your constituency. Yes, it can affect. It can be a foreign policy failure key, certainly, and the rise of third parties. Also, it can cost party unity key if a party divided on. I mean, I have a party unity key for Britain. It's the equivalent of the American nomination key. We don't nominate a candidate in the same way, but I have a unity key. And the Tories, for many years, were a major problem with Europe. The cost of that key goes back to John Major in the 90s.
One huge and deepening problem in the UK seems to be the economic crisis. How do you think, this particular economic crisis is going to impact the efficacy or the effectiveness of these keys?
Well, we've got two keys measure the economy directly. Short-term economy key, that's true if the economy is not in recession in the election campaign. And long-term key, that means true if GDP matches to within 1/10 of 1% GDP of the previous two terms. The last election, long-term GDP, that was lost because of COVID, the lockdowns. That's for the bird. Short-term key was difficult to call. There'd been a technical recession over the winter, but there hadn't been the usual big rise in unemployment you get with a major recession. So I actually had a half turn. In my system, you get a half turn of a key when you find it very difficult to call. In retrospect, I think I should have made a full turn of the key, because although I got the Labour majority always exactly right, I slightly overestimated the Tories, underestimated the Liberals. So I think the both economic keys were lost. But this is a kind of long-term malaise. It's not a deep recession like the 1930s or after 2008. It's a sort of chronic malaise, basically zero growth, low pay. It hasn't been very good since the 2008 crisis. And even before then, the bottom half of the country, wages were not really keeping up very well with inflation. People were kept afloat by tax credits and also credit card debt, which the latter was certainly not very sustainable. As far as the next election goes, it's going to be very difficult indeed, because I think a lot of Labour policies seem to be self-contradictory. They're based saying we're going to go for growth, as if that you just say that and it happens, but the national insurance rise for lower earners, that's going to make, and also some of the workers' rights are going to make employers very loath to employ any more people. Taking away the pensions, winter fuel, that sucks a bit of money out of the economy. The farm tax thing means that some farms go to the wall. There could be food inflation, and that makes it difficult to cut interest rates. And the Miliband's net zero green policies also conflicting with growth. Too many Labour policies, they're in conflict with each other. So I don't think the economic picture look particularly rosy between now and the next election.
There is also, if I remember correctly, one of the keys is social unrest.
Yes.
How far do you think this key would apply to the UK in the current circumstances?
Civil unrest key, as I call it.
From social...
In my book, there's only two occasions since the war with World War II when we had the civil unrest key fully lost. February 1974, we had the 3-day week, miners' strikes, power workers' strikes. In 1979, the winter of discontent. Since then, the key hasn't been lost. We had riots in 1981 and 2011, but they were fairly brief and a long way before the next general election. So, so we had riots last year, but just after the election. But it could be lost if you had rioting like that close to the election, or if it's becoming an endemic problem. Riots, protests, also strikes have crippled the country. So there is, with that case, if it's a sensitive predictor. So for example, 1970, I would have a half turn of the key, because you had a lot of left-wing protests about Vietnam, the famous Grosvenor Square riot outside the American embassy, Enoch Powell Rivers of Blood speech caused a lot of unrest and unease. You had wildcat strike action. So there's a half turn of the key in 1970. We've had increase in strikes in recent years, but there's a very alarming forecast, but I don't know if you heard of him, a guy called Professor David Betts, Canadian-born professor of war. He studies war, especially asymmetric war, terrorism, guerrilla war, and he's been on 3 YouTube platforms in the last week predicting a low-level civil war in the UK.
What do you think about his take and its application in the UK?
I've listened to 3 long interviews with him. I have no reason to doubt the man's credentials. I think he's probably right. The government seems to be following a manual how to start a civil war in your own country. They said they seem to have self-defeating policies, like the idea of any kind of 2-tier sentencing policy is obviously, I think it's unjust, but it's also divisive and inflammatory. The way, kind of 2-tier way they treated the rioters last summer, some of whom did deserve to go to prison, but compared to other things, it does seem to be, this is calculated to cause unrest, but of course their support of Israel has alienated the Muslim vote. So I have no reason to doubt him. I hope he's not right, but I think there's every chance of growing unrest, so that key could be lost. He talked about comparing it to a Latin American dirty war, guerrilla war, assassinations, that kind of thing. Yes, that could topple the civil unrest key, but it would also fuel parties of the right like Reform and maybe also radical left parties. It could lead to multiple third-party keys being lost. It would obviously not be very good for the economy, especially if London was targeted. Like he talked about tax on power utilities, and that would major lose the economic keys for a start. Party unity keys, you cause serious division within parties. Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so we have seen a few issues in the UK politics lately, like, of course, immigration.
Yes.
Then you have another term which has been recently invented, 2-tier policing, yes. And then rape gangs, apparently across the country. And there is a general feeling, I think, in the public that justice has not been done in these cases. How do you think that these particular issues are going to play out? Immigration, you've already talked about.
Yes.
But I would like you to talk about the other 2.
Yes. Well, I mean, the 2-tier justice thing, certainly with these new sentencing guidelines, I think it's kind of obvious that that's what it is, and that certainly will cause resentment in the country. The idea the government are anti the majority of the population, push people more towards more radical right parties. It's polarising. The 2-tier justice thing, I mean, to some extent, the police response to the riots was justified, but they couldn't do nothing. But some people who were sentenced to prison for comments online or streaming it online, more worrying. There's more of a totalitarian feel to it. I mean, I'll make a comparison between the last summer riots and those of the 1980s. The 80s riots were even worse. Although it showed quite a hard right leader, it wasn't just an authoritarian response. They did actually listen. They sent a task force to Liverpool, led by Michael Heseltine, one of the worst hit areas, fact-finding mission to find out what's going on, why people are so angry. And there was the Scarman report on policing. He'd say, yes, although most policemen are doing a good job, there is a problem with discrimination against young black men. This is a factor, and also poor housing. So they did actually listen to the gripes people had behind it, and they did act on it to an extent. Last year that did not happen at all. Starmer just stood up and said, all right-wing thugs. Probably some of the people involved were, but not all of them. They had maybe their concerns about immigration were exaggerated or they were misinformed. But to say they're all thugs is too simplistic. And he tried to play the role of national policeman, saying we arrested 400 people. This kind of we do have to get tough. I mean, if you show this, it's no good. But it's purely authoritarian. Yes, you might be able to stamp down on this episode of violence, but if you do nothing about it, it will keep coming back. So yes, it is this perception of two-tier police. I think it's probably largely not entirely so, but I think they seem to sort of despise the sort of white working class, along with the conservatives as well. They see this as undesirables, really. But yes, I think this is a problem. The perception is a problem as much as the reality is a problem. But it's a very, as David Bett said, the country is explosively configured. It's very difficult. If they don't want to seem to be anti-Muslim or Islamophobic, that would provoke violence on that side. But it's a very difficult situation. I think that justice has to be seen to be done. So I think violence in different groups has to be treated in the same way. You can't tolerate rioting and setting fire to police stations. Obviously not. But some of the sentences, somebody given several years for just grabbing a police trunk from was on the floor, he ran away with it, didn't do anything with it. It seems, I think it could be counterproductive. But as for the grooming gangs, that's a problem that's been going on, I think, going back as far as the 1980s. It's only been talked about in the mainstream media fairly recently. So you can't blame the current government for most of that. It's the fault of multiple previous governments of both parties. But it is enormously damaging and corrosive because it does show sort of, I'm afraid, sort of state collusion in this. The state didn't care about victims. I mean, that's really, really bad. And the fact that it's a long time under both parties suggests that the entire establishment, the entire political elite are rotten and simply do not care. And so I think to a large extent the damage is done. I mean, there's calls for another inquiry. What they could do. I think a maybe more targeted inquiry, looking at areas of the country ignored, might have been a good idea. But these things are really very, very, very damaging because they feed into a long-standing perception that the elites don't care about ordinary people, out of touch with ordinary people, as well as this cultural divide between sort of people who are nativists, traditionalists and traditionalists versus the sort of more globalist elite, that the cult pulling further apart. All of this makes it very difficult for the government. In terms of winning by-elections, that's going to be hard. So the by-election, that key is likely to be lost. It fuels these parties like reform. It keeps them going. For Labour, it is a problem. This is a problem that really was highlighted with Brexit. There's a division, but MPs and activists are mostly culturally left-wing, more than economically so, but a lot of the white working class Labour supporters are actually culturally quite conservative. A little bit like George Galloway. I mean, he's on the left, on the economic spectrum, he's quite far, well, he said well to the left, but culturally he in many ways is a conservative. That split was illuminated by Brexit, and once it's sort of revealed for so long, it can't be forgotten, can it? It's a big problem for Labour. It's a problem for the Conservatives because that the reform are kind of filling the gap, I think.
This also brings to mind the other key, which is the charisma key. Where do you see the charisma at the moment? Which party, which leaders?
Well, it seems to be a bit of a charisma deficit. I mean, he doesn't have any sort of charisma. He hasn't got Tony Blair's ability to connect to the public. Maybe, but no more charismatic, probably less charismatic than John Major in the 90s. People find it rather wooden, rather robotic. I mean, on the Conservative front, I mean, Kemi Badenoch is quite sort of fiery, but I don't know if she made that much impact yet. But she hasn't been there for long enough to say. I mean, there've been people online saying that she's going to be pushed out any minute. I think that's hyperbole. I think she deserves to be getting longer. But I wouldn't describe her as really charismatic. Farage has a kind of charisma, like Trump. It appears limited, relatively limited appeal, irritates the left, liberal left, anti-nationalist type. So, but from third party, he doesn't need to appeal to the whole country to make a kind of breakthrough. There's a bit of obviously a spat going on in reform now. People like Lowe and Habib, but I think they're saying Farage isn't right wing enough. But obviously that's a matter of opinion. In terms of winning votes, he has an ability to connect to the public, which they don't have. So if you get rid of him, then the reformer would not win as many votes without him. I mean, Richard Tice is okay, but he doesn't set the world on fire. So Farage does have that ability to connect to a certain base, specifically on immigration. Probably nice enough guy, but he had no real charisma at all. Rather bland. I mean, Liz Truss was peculiar, but she self-destructed so quickly. Boris Johnson, he did have a kind of charisma, but he was brought down by scandal, dishonesty. I read a good book of Anthony Seldon on Boris Johnson. He's got the affectation of leadership, but he's incompetent. He can't actually lead. He was. I mean, but amazing anecdote during the COVID crisis when he was ill with COVID. He put in a room and he had to join meetings on Zoom, like we're doing now. But he was so inept, he kept logging himself out of a meeting. He had to have a whole collection of laptops outside the door, reach out the arm up, pull out a new laptop. He kept logging himself. He wasn't competent enough, and his policies contradict all this bravado. I mean, he was the one who removed the stipulation that firms had to advertise for jobs internally first. Immigration from outside Europe shot up under his premiership. So, I don't think he's got the credibility because he believes the things that he said he believes. In terms of the charisma, Farage has it to a certain extent at least, but I don't see that many other in the main parties with it.
So what keys do you think will be the most crucial in the next, upcoming elections?
Interesting. The next election most likely will be 4 years away, though of course it could be less than that. We don't know. I think the economic keys are certainly very important, and it's difficult to see how you're going to get strong economic keys. Perhaps they could just about avoid the short-term key being in recession. I think it's going to be a struggle. Foreign policy is uncertain. We don't know what's going to happen with Ukraine, or if the war could be brought to an end, whether Labour will be able to spin it into a Labour success. It's too much volatility there, but it's a dangerous situation. If for example they get British peacekeepers sent to Ukraine, it depends. What if they were to be attacked or something like that? So it's dangerous. So much is out of our hands. I think this is not just Labour. Recent decades, we do tend to sort of still try to keep up the myth that we're some kind of great power when we're not anymore. Tony Blair onwards, our prime ministers are like to sort of strut around the world stage. The UK scene is big enough for them, but we're not at the world power. The army's too small.
Yes,
that's uncertainty. The third party keys are going to be uncertain. Is Reform going to be able to maintain its popularity? Are the Greens going to be able to capitalise on Labour's problems? Like we're talking about cutting welfare, cutting benefits for disabled people, cutting foreign aid, which policies actually to the right of the Tory party. A lot of Labour people, some people I look at on YouTube, are very, very angry, or actually hate Starmer. So the Greens, they tend to be strong when Labour are centrist. When Corbyn was in, they only had about 2% Greens. So mostly party of people very strongly on the left. So they might well be able to capitalise from Starmer, or even new parties. I mean, maybe Corbyn could have a new party. The third party keys are going to be very important. Uncertain. Unity key is important. By-election key, I think that's going to be very difficult for them to win. One uncertain key, policy change. Are they going to make enough policy change to win the key? Because some of these cutting benefits and taking away pensioners' money, that's basically going even further to the right from the Conservatives. That won't win the key. nationalisation of railways, possibly not enough. If they went further than that, that might win. So we're going in different directions. They're not ideologically coherent, but whether they'll be able to win the change key, I don't know. There's a lot of talk about House of Lords reform before the election. That seems to have gone a bit quiet. There was such a big majority that they were well placed to win the key. Scandal key, well, there have been some scandal with Lord Alley and about, was it Starmer seeing a voice coach and I think the COVID stuff won't do much damage because people are sort of fed up with that. They want to move on from that now. Whether the scandal key will trip up Labour, that's a possibility. And the civil unrest we talked about, that's a very important key. There's so much potential for things to go wrong very quickly. So yes, I would say it's very uncertain, but I think Labour's point of view, they got to try to do all they can to help the economy, wary about foreign policy. Yes, foreign policy coup is great, but it's so uncertain. Of course, like as Trump said to Zelensky, we don't hold enough cards. We don't hold enough cards, not just Zelensky. He's punching above our weight could be dangerous. But I think from their point of view, they shouldn't shy away from reform in general, because governments that make as activist governments tend to do a bit better than do-nothing governments. But on the other hand, major splits in the party are very bad. What is so difficult is that they seem to be ideologically incoherent, too many self-defeating ideas. Like we talk about conscription, sending young people to Ukraine. I mean, a few years ago, that was seen as a right-wing reactionary policy. Since the 60s onwards, it's very unpopular to bring back conscription, as an old Tory colonel from the Shires might say. The thing is, so much of a culture and education in Labour is sort of anti-nationalist and saying, Britain, our background is shameful, it's all about slavery, and yet they want people to be patriotic enough to fight for their country. It's too contradictory. That this is a problem for Labour. There's too much contradiction and not enough of a clear direction.
Yes. How do you see the role of optimism? Because there is clearly a serious lack of optimism in the UK at the moment.
Well, I think people now are pretty pessimistic. It's bleak. Compare the mood, Labour's victory last year with 1997 couldn't be hardly be further apart, poles apart. 90s there was a lot more optimism, the early Blair years, and the general feel-good factor. It faded a bit in the noughties, but up until 2008, maybe went complacent to the feel-good factor. And of course, in the second half of the 80s under Thatcher, was a slightly different kind of optimism. Maybe not in all parts of the country, former mining areas, and probably not. But I mean, now there's a general malaise. There's a feeling that politics doesn't work, government doesn't work, politicians don't care, they're out of touch, they're incompetent. They can't actually bring about change. The economy is sort of rigged against ordinary people. The kind of free market thing is sort of run out of the road. It's just for this financial services-based economy, we're not producing anything real, just consume. There isn't much optimism. I mean, I saw Corbyn interviewed on YouTube a year or two ago, and he said, if Labour doesn't offer hope, then what's the point of it? He said, you've got to offer people hope, especially young people, that don't offer any hope at all. It's often been said that Labour tend to get in power at a time of hope, like Clement Attlee after World War II, the hope of building Jerusalem. The 60s, Harold Wilson, the feeling of liberalism in the air, moving away from the old-fashioned sort of world. Blair, at least in the early years, had a tremendous amount of hope, get rid of this tired old Tories, we become a young country again. But there isn't anything like that now. I mean, Starmer got in, I think one of the first things he said is that things are even worse than we thought. Probably true, but they don't really offer any hope, and I don't think the Conservatives do either. There isn't much hope. At least in America, Trump, he offers hope at least to his side, not to the Democrat side, but Americans are more hopeful anyway, they're more optimistic anyway, but there is a hope in the red states. If Kamala Harris had won, there would have been some optimism in blue states around her. But in this country, I could never see her, I could never visualise her as president somehow. No.
So where do you think the UK is heading? Is there a way for UK to get back into the EU? Do you think that Brexit will be reversed in any way? And how will that impact the politics of the UK?
I think it would be difficult to completely reverse it. They could do. I mean, to do it honestly, there'd have to be a second referendum. I think if they were to happen, I think they could win it, because I think majority of people see Brexit as a failure. The immigration from outside of Europe has gone up, partly because we're not getting the people from Eastern Europe anymore. It's not good for the economy. Some people on the right are saying the real problem was in British establishment anyway. With Europe, we were kind of projecting and externalising it, creating a foreign bogeyman where the real problem is our own institutions. So also there's an age factor. I mean, the elderly who most strongly voted for Brexit, of 9 years after the referendum, X number of people have died, have been replaced by Zoomers who wanted. So yeah, I think it could be done. Starmer doesn't seem to show any sign of wanting to do it. A middle way would be to have some kind of deal in which we do allow more freedom of movement. We do allow the workers to come from Eastern Europe without rejoining. I think that would probably be a good idea. We need the workers. We've got aging population, low birth rate, very high rate of sickness. Whether it's some that might be put on, but I think a lot of it isn't. A lot of it's some genuine mental health problems and physical problems. So we've got a lot of people of working age not working. We've got skills gaps. So I think we need immigration. The question is how much and from where. So something like that is possible, but I don't know whether Labour would try to reopen that thing again. And the other problem, of course, is would Europe have us back, and if so, on what terms? The terms might not be the same as before. So I don't think we'll probably rejoin, but as I said, they might do some kind of deal allowing freedom of movement. That if that helps the economy, that helps the economic keys. But obviously people on the right will scream betrayal, so it might still help reform even more, which obviously Labour is frightened of. Yet another situation where if they do something to fix one problem that makes another problem worse, they seem to be in a rock and a hard place government. So it's not easy, but I think if there were to be a referendum to rejoin, I think they will win it.
Tom, thank you so much for your time. What you said was very useful. Got some serious insight.
That wraps up today's conversation on Intellings. A big thank you to our guest for sharing their insights and experiences. If you enjoyed this discussion, don't forget to subscribe to stay updated on future author interviews, book reviews, and in-depth discussions on the latest ideas shaping our world. Turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. Thanks for listening, and until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and stay curious.